My name is Claire Holloway. I'm 33 years old, and 5 years ago, my sister ruined my life with a single lie. She told our parents I had dropped out of medical school. That was all it took. Within a week, my number was blocked. My emails went unanswered. A certified letter I mailed from Albuquerque came back unopened with my mother's handwriting on the envelope. My parents didn't attend my graduation. They weren't at my wedding. For 5 years, I existed somewhere outside the borders of my own family. Then last month, my sister was rushed into the emergency room where I work. And when the attending physician walked in to treat her, my parents went pale. It was a Tuesday night in Phoenix, Arizona, the kind of dry desert night where the air outside still holds the day's heat even after midnight. Inside Mercy Valley Medical Center, the ER hummed the way it always does, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, monitors chirping softly, the low murmur of nurses exchanging updates at the central station. I had just finished suturing a construction worker's forearm when the trauma pager buzzed on my hip. Female patient, late 30s, septic shock suspected, incoming by ambulance. I stripped off my gloves and stepped into the hallway as the paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the automatic doors. The patient was unconscious, oxygen mask fogging faintly with each shallow breath. Her skin looked gray under the hospital lights. Blood pressure dropping, one of the paramedics called out. Possible infection after cosmetic procedure. Fever spiked on the ride over. I nodded and reached for the intake tablet from the nurse's station. My charge nurse, Miguel Ramirez, 48, steady as bedrock after 20 years in emergency medicine, was already calling for labs and IV antibiotics. "What do we have, Doc?" he asked. "Let's confirm vitals first," I said, automatically scanning the screen. Then I saw the name, Ava Holloway. For a second, the noise of the ER seemed to recede like a tide pulling back from shore. 5 years collapsed into a single hard moment. My sister, the woman who had told my parents I quit medical school, the woman whose story had erased me from our family. Miguel must have noticed something change in my face. "You okay, Claire?" he asked quietly. I looked up at the patient on the stretcher. Her hair was damp with sweat. Dark circles hollowed her eyes. She looked older than the last time I had seen her, thinner too, but there was no mistaking who she was. "I'm fine," I said, and then I did the only thing a doctor is allowed to do in that moment. I went to work. "Start broad-spectrum antibiotics," I told Miguel. "Blood cultures now, 2 IV lines." The team moved quickly. Monitors beeped, nurses positioned equipment. A resident began documenting the case. Through the glass doors at the end of the hallway, I saw 2 figures rush through the entrance from the parking lot. Even from 30 feet away, I knew them. My father moved first, still tall at 64, his shoulders rigid with panic. My mother followed close behind, clutching her purse like it might hold the answer to whatever nightmare had just begun. They hurried toward the nurse's desk, voices urgent. "That's our daughter," my father said, breathless. "We need to speak to the doctor in charge." Miguel glanced toward me without saying a word. I stepped out from behind the trauma bay curtain, my white coat catching the light. The badge on my chest read clearly, Claire Holloway, MD, attending emergency physician. My parents didn't see me at first, but they were about to. And when they did, 5 years of lies were going to collide with one very inconvenient truth. In our house in Tucson, Arizona, there were 2 daughters, but only one of them was ever truly seen. My sister Ava was 4.5 years older than me, and from the beginning she seemed to understand something about people that I never quite figured out. She knew how to make adults laugh. She knew how to hold eye contact just long enough to seem confident without seeming rude. By the time she was 10, she could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new admirers and someone offering her a cookie. My parents loved that about her. My father, Richard Holloway, managed a regional parts warehouse outside Tucson. He believed deeply in hard work and respectability, the kind of man who ironed his shirts on Sunday night so Monday morning would start correctly. My mother, Linda Holloway, worked part-time as a dental receptionist and spent the rest of her energy making sure our family looked put together from the outside. Ava made that easy. She joined theater and middle school student government in high school, and every fundraiser or charity drive the neighborhood ever organized. She was the kind of daughter people brag about to their friends. Claire's sister, Ava, so talented, so outgoing. Meanwhile, I spent most of my childhood at the kitchen table with a textbook open. It wasn't that I was unhappy, I was just quiet. Science made sense to me in ways people sometimes didn't. Cells divided in predictable ways. Chemical reactions followed rules. If you worked hard enough, you could eventually understand why things happened. People were harder. One afternoon when I was 13, I came home from school carrying a second-place ribbon from the state science fair. My project had been about bacterial resistance to antibiotics, which at the time I thought was the most fascinating thing in the world. When I walked into the house, the living room was empty. On the coffee table sat Ava's script for the community theater production she was starring in that weekend. My parents were already there at the rehearsal. I stood in the doorway for a moment holding that ribbon, listening to the quiet of the house. Then I put it on the kitchen counter and made myself a sandwich. Things like that happened a lot. When Ava had a play, we all went. When I had a competition or presentation. My parents usually had a reason they couldn't make it. Not cruel reasons, reasonable ones. Work schedules, car trouble, a headache. Over time, you stop expecting people to show up. You adjust. By the time I was in high school, I had figured out that the easiest way to exist in our house was to stay out of the way and do well enough in school that no one had to worry about me. Ava filled the room, I filled the silence. But something changed during my senior year. The letter arrived on a warm afternoon in April. A thick envelope with the seal of the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. I remember standing at the kitchen counter staring at it for almost a full minute before opening it. When I finally did, my hands were shaking. Accepted. After years of AP classes, volunteer hours at the hospital, and late nights studying organic chemistry, it had actually happened. When my father came home that evening, I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing the way it did when he was concentrating. Then he looked up at me. For the first time I could remember, he wasn't looking past me or through me. He was looking directly at me. "Well," he said, setting the letter down on the table, "maybe you'll make something of yourself after all." It wasn't a warm sentence, but in our house it was the closest thing to praise I had ever received. My mother called 2 relatives that night to tell them the news, and across the dinner table, Ava smiled at me. The smile looked perfect, but something in her eyes had gone very still. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. I thought my sister was proud of me. I didn't realize that in our family, attention was a limited resource. And for the first time in our lives, it wasn't pointing at her anymore. I was 28 when my life split cleanly into a before and an after. By then, I was in my 3rd year at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine in Albuquerque, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing inside the future I had worked for. The hours were brutal, the debt was real, and I was tired almost all the time, but it was the kind of tired that comes with purpose. And I wasn't alone. Daniel Mercer and I had met during my 2nd year. He was quiet in the way confident men sometimes are, with none of the need to fill silence just to prove he belonged in it. He taught high school chemistry on the west side of the city and made fun of my color-coded study charts with enough affection that I let him get away with it. By the spring of my 3rd year, he wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my person. Then in late August, everything changed. Daniel had been feeling run down for weeks. He blamed work, the heat, the start of the school year. Then came the swelling in his ankles, the nausea, the exhaustion that sleep didn't touch. 2 days later, he was admitted to the hospital. By the end of that week, we had a diagnosis: acute kidney failure, on top of a condition no one had caught in time. I remember the nephrologist's face when she said it. Calm, careful, experienced enough to know that bad news lands hardest when it's delivered gently. Daniel needed a transplant, not eventually, not someday, soon. His mother had died years earlier. His father lived in Missouri and had been out of the picture even longer than my own parents had been emotionally. There was no big network to call, no bench of relatives waiting to step in, just me. I got tested because that was what people do when the person they love is suddenly standing at the edge of something terrifying, and I was a match. The entire week that followed felt like I was moving through bright, airless rooms, surgical consults, lab work, consent forms, meetings with the transplant coordinator. I met with the Dean of Student Affairs at the medical school on a Thursday morning and explained everything. He approved a formal medical leave of absence for 1 semester. My place in the program would be held. The paperwork was filed the same day. It was real. It was documented. It was temporary. I told Ava because despite everything, she was still my sister. I called her that Saturday afternoon from the parking garage outside the transplant clinic. I can still remember the concrete heat rising through the windshield, the smell of dust and old oil, the stack of hospital folders on the passenger seat. I told her Daniel was sick. I told her I was donating a kidney. I told her I had taken an official leave from school and would return in January. She was silent for a moment. Then her voice softened in exactly the way it always did when she wanted to sound caring. "Oh, Claire," she said, "that's huge." I laughed once quietly because I was exhausted and scared and trying not to cry in a parking garage. "Yeah," I said, "it is. She told me not to worry about our parents yet. She said they would panic and make everything harder. She said I should focus on Daniel, on the surgery, on getting through the next few weeks. For once, it sounded like sensible advice. I took comfort where I could get it. The surgery happened the following Wednesday. Daniel came through it well. I did too, though recovery was slower than I had expected. Pain has a way of making time both heavy and slippery. Days blurred. Hospital lights replaced daylight. Nurses came and went. Meals arrived on trays I barely touched. 3 nights after my surgery, while Daniel was asleep in the room next to mine, my phone started vibrating across the bedside table. It was my father. Richard Holloway did not call me casually. He called for information or instruction or judgment. I answered on the second ring. His voice was cold enough to make the room feel colder. "Your sister told us everything." I pushed myself up too fast and felt the incision pull. "What are you talking about?" He didn't lower his voice. He didn't ask a question. He simply began listing pieces of a story I had never heard before. That I had dropped out of medical school, that I was hiding it, that there was a man involved, that I was too ashamed to tell them the truth. For a few seconds, I honestly thought there had been some kind of mistake, some crossed wire, some misunderstanding so stupid it would collapse the minute I explained it. Then he said one sentence I never forgot. "Ava showed us enough. Enough. Not proof, not documents, not anything concrete, just enough." And for the first time, sitting there with a fresh surgical scar under my hospital gown, I understood something I should have learned much earlier. In my family, a lie didn't have to be strong. It just had to come from the right daughter. The first thing I did after my father hung up that night was try to explain. At the time, it seemed like the obvious solution. There had been a misunderstanding. Ava must have told them something incomplete, or maybe they misunderstood what she said. Once they heard the real story, Daniel, the transplant, the leave of absence from school, everything would settle back into place. That was what I believed during the first phone call. By the 14th call, I understood something else entirely. The morning after my father's call, the hospital sunlight was already pushing through the thin blinds in my recovery room. My abdomen ached when I moved, and every breath reminded me that a piece of my body was now keeping Daniel alive down the hallway. But none of that mattered as much as the message on my phone. "Call Dad, call Mom, explain." I dialed my mother first. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Mom, it's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's gotten mixed up. I didn't drop out of school. I took a medical leave because Daniel needed a transplant. I have the paperwork from the university. I can send it to you." I waited. Nothing. Later that afternoon, I called my father again. He answered this time. "I already told you," he said flatly. "Your sister explained the situation." "There's no situation," I said, feeling the incision pull as I shifted upright in the hospital bed. "Dad, I'm literally in the hospital because I donated a kidney. The school approved the leave. I go back in January." Silence. Then a slow exhale. You expect us to believe that? The words landed harder than I expected. I can send the documentation, I said quickly. The dean signed the leave forms. The transplant coordinator. That's enough, he interrupted. Not angry, just finished. You've made your choices. The line went dead. Over the next 5 days, I tried everything. A reasonable person tries when a family relationship starts collapsing. I called 14 times. My calls went to voicemail after the first 2 days. I sent emails from my university account with attachments, the leave of absence letter, the hospital paperwork confirming the transplant surgery, even a note from the transplant coordinator verifying the timeline. No replies. On the third day, I mailed a certified letter to my parents' house in Tucson. Inside the envelope were printed copies of every document. At the post office counter, the clerk stamped the receipt and slid it toward me. You'll get a signature confirmation, she said. I remember nodding like that meant something, like proof still mattered. Recovery from surgery forced me to move slowly. Walking down the hospital hallway felt like crossing a football field. By the time Daniel was discharged and we made it back to our apartment in Albuquerque, the letter had already arrived in Tucson. I checked the tracking number every few hours. 3 days later, the envelope appeared in our mailbox, unopened. Across the front, in my mother's careful handwriting, were 4 words written in blue pen: "Return to sender." I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope for a long time. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic on Central Avenue. Daniel was resting in the bedroom, still weak from surgery. The documents inside the envelope were still perfectly straight, untouched. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Up until then, I believed this was a misunderstanding that patience could fix. But misunderstandings require 2 people willing to listen. My parents had already decided which version of the story they believed, and they had chosen it without ever asking me a single question. That week, something else happened that I didn't understand at the time. My Aunt Laura, my mother's younger sister who lived outside Flagstaff, left me a voicemail. Her voice sounded careful, like someone stepping across ice they weren't sure would hold. "Claire," she said softly, "I heard some things from your parents. If you get this, call me back." I stared at the phone for a long moment after the message ended. Then I set it down on the counter. At the time, I didn't call her. I still believed I could fix things the right way. What I didn't realize yet was that back in Tucson, my absence had already started turning into something else, a story, and the only person telling it was Ava. By November, I understood that no one was coming, not my father with a stiff apology he didn't mean, not my mother with tears and a casserole dish and some explanation about how things had gotten out of hand, not Ava with a confession, not even a question. The silence had settled into something heavier than anger. It was structure. Daniel was still recovering, though he was getting stronger every week. He moved carefully around our apartment in Albuquerque, one hand pressed to his side when he stood too quickly, but his color was back. Mine was too. The scar on my abdomen had started to pull less when I walked, and my follow-up labs were good. On paper, everything that mattered was stabilizing, except my life had split cleanly away from the people who were supposed to know me best. The re-entry forms for the spring semester sat on our kitchen table for 3 days before I touched them. It wasn't the coursework that frightened me. It was what going back meant. If I re-enrolled, I would be choosing a future that no longer had my family in it. I would be saying, in effect, that I understood the loss was real and permanent enough to build around. That was the part I kept staring at. One evening, Daniel found me sitting at the table with the forms spread out in front of me and my mother's unopened letter beside them. I still had not thrown that envelope away. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because it had become proof of something uglier than rejection, proof that evidence could sit right in front of a person and still not matter. Daniel lowered himself carefully into the chair across from me. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "Yes, I do." He looked at me for a long moment and didn't argue. That was one of the kindest things about him. He knew when comfort was useful and when it was just a softer version of denial. If you go back, he said quietly, you won't be going back for them. I looked down at the university seal at the top of the page. No, I said, I won't. That was the moment something hardened into clarity. Not rage, not revenge, just a line I could finally see. For months, maybe for years, if I was being honest, I had still been living as if my real life would begin the moment my family recognized it. As if every exam, every overnight study session, every sacrifice only became meaningful once someone back in Tucson admitted it had value. But I was already paying the price. The hours were mine, the debt was mine. The body on that operating table in my future, whoever it might be, would be mine too. If I became a doctor, it would not be because my father had finally looked at me and approved. It would be because I chose it while knowing exactly who had turned away. The next morning, I filled out the re-entry packet. I signed my name where the registrar's office required it. I attached the medical leave documentation already on file. I submitted everything electronically before I could talk myself back into grief. When the confirmation email arrived 2 days later, I stared at it for a long time. Re-enrollment approved. Spring placement confirmed. Simple words. But to me they felt like the first plank laid down over open water. I called Aunt Laura that weekend. She answered on the second ring, and when she heard my voice, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. I didn't know if you'd call, she said. I almost didn't. There was a pause. Then carefully she said, Your mother told people you quit school, Claire. I closed my eyes. People, family, friends from church, a couple neighbors. Her voice was cautious pained. Ava's been managing the story, managing the story. I wrote those words down on the back of an old grocery receipt and kept it in my wallet for years. Not because I needed the reminder, because it was the first time someone from my family admitted there was a story being managed at all. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen and made myself say the truth out loud. They are not coming back for me. The apartment stayed quiet. No one contradicted me. And for the first time since my father's call, that silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a beginning. The pager on my hip went off at 2:47 a.m. In an emergency department, that sound always cuts through everything: conversation, paperwork, exhaustion. It's a sharp electronic buzz that means someone's night has just become the worst night of their life. I clipped the tablet from the charging station and walked quickly toward the ambulance entrance. Incoming Miguel Ramirez called from the nurse's station, already reading from the dispatch screen. Female, late 30s, severe infection after cosmetic injection, hypotensive, fever 104, septic shock, I asked. Looks that way. The ambulance doors burst open a moment later. Paramedics rolled the stretcher through the automatic doors, wheels rattling over the threshold. The woman on the gurney was unconscious. Oxygen mask. IV already running. Skin pale and damp with sweat. Blood pressure 80/50, the paramedic reported. Temp peaked on the ride over. Infection started after a cosmetic filler procedure 2 days ago. Local clinic, not a hospital. I nodded once. Bay 7, I said. Let's move. The ER team shifted into motion with the quiet efficiency that only comes from repetition. Monitors came online. IV lines were checked. A resident began pulling up the patient intake file on the computer terminal. I stepped closer to the bed. Let's get blood cultures and start broad-spectrum antibiotics, I said. Draw lactate levels. I want fluids going now. The resident typed quickly while the nurse clipped sensors onto the patient's fingers. What's the patient's name? I asked. The resident glanced at the screen. Then she paused. Holloway, she said. Ava Holloway. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Repeat that. Ava Holloway, she said again, slower this time. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 5 years. 5 years without a single conversation. 5 years since the night my father told me my sister had shown them enough. And now here she was, unconscious, fighting for her life. Miguel was watching me carefully. He had worked with me long enough to notice small changes: when my voice shifted, when my shoulders stiffened, when something personal slipped through the cracks of a professional moment. You know the patient? He asked quietly. My sister, I said. The words felt strange in my mouth. In medicine, there are protocols for everything. If a doctor recognizes a patient as family, the safest path is recusal, step aside. Bring in another physician, remove yourself from the case. But septic shock doesn't wait for administrative clarity. She's unstable, Miguel said, glancing at the monitor. Pressure's dropping again. I took a breath and stepped forward. Start another liter of fluids, I said. Let's stabilize first, then we'll talk about reassignment. The team moved quickly. Monitors beeped faster. Someone wheeled in the ultrasound machine. I kept my eyes on the numbers. Blood pressure, oxygen, heart rate. Data was easier than memory. 10 minutes later, the immediate crisis had slowed enough for the ER to breathe again. That's when the doors at the far end of the hallway burst open. Two figures hurried toward the nurse's station. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape of my father's shoulders. Richard Holloway still walked the same way he always had, fast, purposeful, as if the world owed him answers quickly. My mother was right behind him, clutching her purse with both hands. Where is she? My father demanded at the front desk. Our daughter was brought here. Miguel glanced toward me. You want me to take this? He asked quietly. For a second, the old instinct returned. Hide. Let someone else handle it. Let another doctor step forward while I disappeared behind the curtain and stayed the ghost my family already believed I was. But 5 years of silence had done something unexpected. It had burned away the need to explain myself. No, I said. I adjusted the white coat on my shoulders and stepped into the hallway light. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway. My voice was calm, professional, neutral. They both turned. At first, they didn't recognize me. Why would they? 5 years is a long time to erase someone. Then my mother's eyes dropped to the badge on my chest. Claire Holloway, M.D., attending emergency physician. Her hand shot out and grabbed my father's arm so hard I saw his sleeve wrinkle under her grip. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The story they had believed for half a decade was standing right in front of them, and it was wearing a doctor's coat. For a few seconds, none of us moved. The emergency department didn't stop around us. Monitors continued to beep. A nurse hurried past with a medication tray. Somewhere behind the curtain in Bay 6, a patient groaned. But in the small pocket of space between my parents and me, time seemed to hold still. My father's eyes moved slowly from my face to the badge clipped to my coat. Claire Holloway, M.D., attending emergency physician. He read it twice. My mother's grip tightened around his arm, her knuckles pale against the fabric of his sleeve. That can't be right, she said. The words came out small, like something fragile had just cracked. I kept my voice calm. Your daughter is in Bay 7, I said. She's being treated for a severe infection. We've stabilized her blood pressure for now, but she's still in critical condition. I didn't say Ava. I didn't say sister. In that moment, the safest language was the professional one. My father finally found his voice. We need the doctor in charge, he said. Miguel, standing a few feet away at the nurse's station, lowered his head slightly and tried very hard not to smile. You're looking at her, he said. My father's jaw tightened. That's not possible. He looked back at me again, searching for something that would let the world return to the version he understood. You dropped out, he said flatly. The sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't even angry. It was a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a man who had repeated it to himself for years. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was standing right there in front of him, stitched into the white coat I was wearing, printed on the hospital badge clipped to my chest. Explaining it would almost have felt unnecessary. Behind us, the curtain in Bay 7 shifted as a nurse stepped out. Dr. Holloway, she said quietly, lactate levels just came back. Work. The word saved me. I'll be there in a minute, I said. I turned back to my parents. Your daughter is receiving the appropriate treatment, I said. If her condition changes, someone from our team will update you. Then I stepped past them and went back into the trauma bay. Inside, the air felt colder. Ava lay motionless under the hospital lights, IV lines taped to both arms. The antibiotics had started flowing through the tubing. The monitor above her head traced the uneven rhythm of her heartbeat. For a moment, I simply looked at her. 5 years. The last time I had seen her face to face, she had been standing in my parents' kitchen, smiling across the dinner table after my medical school acceptance letter arrived. Now she looked smaller somehow, less certain. Miguel stepped up beside me. "Hell of a family reunion," he murmured. I didn't respond. He studied my expression for a moment. "You want me to call Dr. Patel and transfer the case?" he asked. "No one would blame you, Doctor." Anika Patel was the other attending physician on the night shift rotation. She lived 15 minutes away and could be here quickly if needed. For a second, the idea was tempting. Step back, let someone else take over. But that would mean leaving Ava's care in the hands of someone who didn't know the whole story. And it would also mean walking away from the one place where the truth had already begun to reveal itself. "No," I said finally. Miguel nodded once. "Your call." A few minutes later, a young nurse named Erica approached the bed with a clipboard. "Her parents keep asking questions out there," she said. "They're confused." That word lingered in the air. Confused. For 5 years, my parents had believed a version of my life that never existed. Now that version had just walked into the emergency department and put on a doctor's coat. And confusion was only the beginning. Because out in the waiting area, my father was already pulling out his phone. I watched through the glass doors as he stepped aside and made a call. His voice was low, but I could read the shape of the words on his lips. Ava. He thought he was calling his daughter, but the person he was about to speak to was the one who had built the lie in the first place, and something told me she wasn't going to surrender that story quietly. My father stayed on the phone for almost 10 minutes. I watched him through the glass wall of the ER waiting area while pretending to focus on Ava's chart. He paced slowly near the vending machines, one hand pressed against his ear, his voice low and tight. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't calm. When he finally hung up, he stood still for a moment, staring at the floor like a man trying to hold two versions of reality in the same place. Then he looked toward the trauma bay, toward me. But instead of approaching, he turned and walked back to the chairs beside my mother. For the rest of the night, the emergency department settled into the strange rhythm that comes after a crisis has been slowed but not solved. Ava's blood pressure stabilized under fluids and antibiotics, though the infection was still aggressive. The ICU team was preparing a bed upstairs. In medicine, there's a moment after the storm where everything becomes quieter, but the outcome is still uncertain. This was that moment. Just before sunrise, the ICU transport team arrived to move Ava upstairs. I stepped aside as they transferred her carefully from the ER gurney to the transport bed. The machines followed her IV pump's oxygen monitors, tracing the fragile line between stability and collapse. Miguel gave me a sideways glance. "You sure you're holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine." He didn't push it. Somewhere near the nurse's station, the automatic doors opened again. This time, the person who stepped inside moved slowly, looking around the ER like she wasn't sure where to go. My Aunt Laura. She looked older than the last time I had seen her, her gray hair pulled back in the same careful bun she'd worn most of my life. In one hand, she carried a worn leather folder. When she saw me, relief washed across her face. "Claire," she said softly. I stepped toward her. "Laura, what are you doing here?" She glanced briefly toward the waiting area where my parents were sitting. "They called me," she said Ava was in the hospital, her voice lowered. "And I figured if everyone was going to be in the same building, it might be time." She held up the leather folder. "For this?" I frowned slightly. "What is it?" Laura exhaled slowly. "5 years of things I never showed your parents." The words landed heavier than I expected. Inside the folder were documents, emails printed on plain paper, and a few photographs. I saw the university letterhead immediately. My leave of absence approval from medical school, the transplant paperwork from the hospital, copies of the emails I had sent my parents that week, emails they had never answered. "You kept these?" I asked quietly. Laura nodded. "You sent them to me too, remember? When your parents stopped responding. I had forgotten that. Back then, I had been sending explanations anywhere I thought someone might listen. I didn't know what Ava had told them, Laura said. But I knew something didn't add up. She tapped the folder gently, so I kept everything. Through the glass wall, I could see my father again. He was watching us now, suspicion slowly replacing confusion. Why didn't you show them before I asked? Laura's mouth tightened. Because they didn't want to see it. The answer felt painfully accurate. For 5 years, the truth had existed in pieces, emails, hospital records, university forms. But truth only works when someone is willing to pick it up. Laura looked back toward my parents. They're scared tonight, she said quietly. Fear does something interesting to people. Sometimes it finally makes them listen. I followed her gaze. My father had stood up. My mother was watching us with the tense expression of someone who could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Laura handed the folder to me. You don't have to use this, she said, but if you decide to. She left the sentence unfinished. I looked down at the stack of papers in my hands. For years, the lie had lived comfortably because no one forced it into the light. Now the truth was sitting inside a thin leather folder. Not loud, not dramatic, just patient. And for the first time since that phone call 5 years earlier, I realized something important. I didn't need to argue with my family. I just needed to let the truth stand in the same room as the lie. I did not confront my parents in the hallway. I did not hand them the folder like evidence in a courtroom. I did not raise my voice, list my losses, or ask them whether 5 years had been long enough. I went upstairs with the ICU team, signed the transfer notes, gave report to the intensivist, and finished my shift. That was the first consequence, not drama, procedure. By the time I came back down to the waiting area, the sky outside the hospital windows had turned the pale gray of early morning. My parents were still there. My mother stood when she saw me, but my father stayed seated, both hands on his knees, his face set in the rigid expression he wore whenever the world refused to obey him. Aunt Laura was standing off to one side, the leather folder tucked under her arm like something steady and ordinary. I'm off shift now, I said. If you want to talk, we talk once. Calmly. My father looked up at me. We were lied to. It was the first true sentence he had spoken to me in years, and even then he said it like he was testing whether it would hold. Aunt Laura stepped forward before I could answer. She opened the folder and handed my mother the first document. My approved medical leave from the university, then the hospital records from the kidney donation, then printed copies of the emails I had sent that week, each one time-stamped, each one unanswered. My mother read the first page, then the second. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. My father reached for the transplant paperwork next. His eyes moved across the lines slowly, methodically, like a man trying to find the flaw that would save him from what he was reading. There must be more to it, he said. It wasn't denial exactly. It was worse. Habit. Aunt Laura pulled out one final page. There is, she said quietly. It was a printout of a text message Ava had sent her 4 years earlier. Don't tell them Claire went back. It'll only start everything up again. No performance, no explanation, just strategy. My father stared at the message for a long time. Then he sat back in the plastic chair and looked older than he had 6 hours earlier. My mother started to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, just the kind of crying that comes when a person understands that the worst thing they did was not an accident. It was a choice repeated over time. I stood there and let the silence do what arguments never could. What happens now? My mother asked finally. The question hung in the air. Not what do we say, not how do we fix it. What happens now? I answered carefully. Now Ava recovers, I said. And after that, the truth gets corrected the same way the lie was spread. Completely. My father looked up. What does that mean? It means every relative, every family friend, every person who was told I dropped out, every person who heard I threw my future away, gets the truth in writing from her. Not from me, neither of them argued. For once, the structure of accountability was clearer than their discomfort. And if you want any kind of relationship with me after this, I said, you do not get one by crying in a hospital waiting room. You get one by doing the work you should have done 5 years ago. Counseling, honesty, consistency. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. My father didn't speak. That was consequence too. For him, silence was not surrender. It was the collapse of certainty. Ava regained full consciousness that afternoon. I did not go into her room alone. The ICU nurse was there when I entered, and so were both of my parents. She looked weak, frightened, and painfully aware of the monitors around her. But the first thing she did when she saw me was search my face for softness. There wasn't any. Then she looked at the folder in my mother's lap, and she understood. Not everything, just enough. Enough to know the story had finally turned around and was facing her. She tried the smallest version of herself first. I was trying to protect them, she whispered. No one answered. That was the highest stake of all. Not being shouted down, not being punished, just not being believed anymore. I stood at the foot of her bed and spoke the way I had learned to in medicine, clear, measured, impossible to mistake. When you're discharged, you are going to correct this, I said, in writing, to everyone. Ava looked at our father. He didn't rescue her. She looked at our mother. She didn't either. For the first time in my life, my sister had no audience willing to help her keep the lie alive, and that was the moment the karma truly began. Ava was discharged 9 days after she came into my ER. 3 days later, the email went out. I was standing in my kitchen in Phoenix when it arrived, my coffee cooling beside the sink, Daniel reading the news at the table behind me. The subject line was plain: no drama, no performance, a correction. I opened it slowly. Ava had written to every relative she could name, every family friend my parents still spoke to, and several people from church in Tucson who had repeated her version of my life for years. She stated in clear language that I had never dropped out of medical school, that I had taken an approved medical leave to donate a kidney to Daniel, that I had returned, graduated, and become a physician. She admitted that she had lied and that our parents had acted on information she gave them. No excuses, no softening, just the truth finally written down where it could not be reshaped later. That was the end of the lie. Not emotionally, not all at once. But structurally, permanently, publicly, yes. My parents started counseling the following week. I didn't attend. That was not my work to do for them. But every other Friday, my mother sent a short text confirming they had gone. No speeches, no pleading, just proof of consistency. My father never texted. What he did instead was quieter. 6 weeks after Ava's discharge, a package arrived at our front door. Inside was the unopened certified letter I had mailed 5 years earlier from Albuquerque. The envelope was still sealed. My mother had written one sentence on a note card tucked beneath it. You were telling the truth, and we chose the easier child. I sat with that sentence for a long time, not because it fixed anything, but because it named the wound correctly. A few months later, Mercy Valley held its annual Clinical Excellence Dinner. It wasn't a glamorous event hotel ballroom, rubber, chicken, soft lighting, the usual speeches, but it mattered. Daniel came with me. So did Miguel, who teased me all evening for pretending I didn't care about the award I was up for. I won. When they called my name, I stood, walked to the stage, and accepted the plaque with steady hands. From the podium, I could see almost the entire room, and near the back, seated at a table they had paid for themselves and chosen without asking me, were my parents. They didn't wave, they didn't try to claim the moment. They just stood when everyone else stood and applauded like two people who understood they were witnessing a life they had once refused to see. That mattered more than I expected, not because it erased the years. Nothing could, not the graduation they missed, not the wedding chair that stayed empty, not the way I learned to stop checking my phone for Tucson area codes that never came. But justice had already happened before that room. Ava's lie had been corrected. Her credibility was gone. My parents had to live with what they had chosen, and they had begun, however late, to face it honestly. What remained was not revenge, it was ownership. On a cool Sunday morning in early March, my parents came to our house for breakfast. Daniel made coffee. I made French toast. My mother brought strawberries she'd washed and cut herself. My father stood awkwardly near the table until I pointed to the cabinet where we kept the plates. "There are 4," I said. He nodded once and set them down carefully one at a time. 4 plates, not a restoration, not a miracle, just a new table built on truth instead of performance. I am still not the daughter I was before, but I am something better than that now. I am a woman who knows exactly who she is, what it costs to become her, and which doors in her life open only by her hand. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know what part felt most true to your own experience with family justice or healing. And if you want to stay for the next story, you can like, subscribe, and keep going with me.